Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome to Adventures in History. Today's topic is Ulysses S. Grant, Part 12, Trip Around the World, 1877 to 1879. We stopped last time in 1877. Ulysses S. Grant had finished his 2 terms as U.S. President, and he was at the beginning of this 2-year and 4-month trip around the world. He wanted to travel, and he traveled with his dear wife Julia, and then 2 of their sons came, one at different times. The first stop on the trip was in England, and Ulysses S. Grant was popular all over the world. He was famous. There was bedlam in Liverpool when Grant arrived. He was very popular, the man who had won the Civil War and ended slavery. He took a Pullman car train to Manchester. The British were charmed by Ulysses S. Grant. In London, he met British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli. He met authors Thomas Huxley, Robert Browning, and Anthony Trollope. He did not want to review the British troops. He was asked to do that. On June 26, he met with Queen Victoria at Windsor Castle. Grant was pro-British. In London, he met the Duke of Wellington. They discussed horse racing. Grant expressed his opinion that he disliked horse racing, which he believed was a cruel sport. He believed it was cruel to the horses. The Grant and Julia visited their daughter Nellie, who had a son, on her husband's Sartoris estate in Southampton. Nellie appeared to be happy. Her marriage had not yet become a disaster. Julia and Grant crossed the English Channel and met with King Leopold II of Belgium. He also met Richard Wagner, the famous composer, in Heidelberg. Grant hoped to meet Italian General Garibaldi. He continued to worry about money. He had an investment that paid off, that was paying for the trip. On September 22nd, Grant was in Newcastle, England. 150,000 workers from the factories and mines came to see him, and he gave a speech in which he said that without labor there was nothing worth fighting over in war. And in war, the workers supported those who were involved in destruction. The audience was very enthusiastic. On October 24th, Grant was in Paris, France, and he met the famous author of The Hunchback of Notre Dame, among other novels, Victor Hugo, who was cold, who believed that Grant supported Prussia during the Franco-Prussian War. Grant, now in his travels in Paris, he approached Napoleon's tomb at Les Invalides. Grant steered away. He did not want to romanticize warfare. Of course, he was pro-British, so he was not particularly pro-Napoleon, an enemy of Great Britain. Julia did see Napoleon's tomb and was thrilled. Grant enjoyed mingling with the common people of Paris, France. He visited the studio of Frederick Bartholdi, and watched him working on sculpting the Statue of Liberty. Grant walked the streets of Paris, and the city became familiar to him. December of 1877, he traveled on the warship Vandalia in the Mediterranean Sea. They steamed to Italy, Egypt, and the Holy Land. Grant was free from worry and care. He read Mark Twain's book Innocents Abroad. He also read Homer's The Odyssey. In Egypt, he met Ismail the Magnificent. He took a boat trip on the Nile River and was transfixed by the Sphinx. Grant and Julia spent happy days on the Nile River. In March of 1878, he was in Constantinople in the Ottoman Empire. The Sultan of the Ottoman Sultan gave him 2 pure-blood Arabian stallions. Grant had this to say about his travels at that point, quote, "My impression of peoples are that in the East they have a form of government and a civilization that will always repress progress and development. Syria and Asia Minor are rich of soil as the great Northwest in our own country, and are blessed with a climate far more suitable to production. The people would be industrious if they had encouragement, but they are treated as slaves, and all they produce is taken from them for the benefit of the governing classes, and to maintain them in a luxurious and licentious life. Women are degraded even beneath a slave. They have no more rights than a brute. In fact, the donkey is their superior in privileges. Grant and Julia traveled to Athens, France, where they met the king of Greece, who boarded their ship and visited with Grant. The Parthenon was illuminated in honor of Ulysses S. Grant. In Rome, in Italy, he had a private audience with Pope Leo XIII. He also met Italian King Umberto. He saw the Colosseum and the arches of Titus and Constantine, as well as the Sistine Chapel. In May, he returned to Paris, France, for the Universal Exposition. Their son, Jesse, who was with them on this trip, left to attend Columbia Law School, and their other son, Fred, came to accompany them on as their trip continued. In Berlin, Prussia, Grant met Otto von Bismarck. He found that most stimulating, and he did agree to review the troops there. He recommended that they drop the bayonet. He felt it was not helpful in warfare. In July, he was in Denmark and Scandinavia. Grant was knowledgeable about Danish history. A banquet was proposed for him in Denmark. However, Grant was tired of banquets. He wanted to rest for a week there. In late July, he was in St. Petersburg, Russia, and met Tsar Alexander II at the Summer Palace. The Tsarina showed Julia the carriage of Peter the Great. Grant explored St. Petersburg on foot. He finished the summer in Vienna, Austria, and met Emperor Franz Joseph I. In Madrid, Spain, Grant again walked the streets, and that city became familiar to him as well. In the fall, the government steamer, Richmond, was provided for him, and he traveled to India, China, and Japan via the Mediterranean Sea and the Suez Canal. February of 1879, Grant was in Bombay, India. He rode an elephant near a marble quarry. In India, Grant and Julia visited the Taj Mahal in daylight and returned it in moonlight. Julia said that the U.S. Capitol was more beautiful than the Taj Mahal. In Thailand, they met the royal family. In Hong Kong, a crowd of 100,000 came to see him. In Canton, China, 200,000 people came. In Shanghai, there was a torchlit parade in honor of Grant. He saw the Great Wall of China, and Grant said that it was not practical today in terms of military defense. Grant met the Prince Kung of China, and they talked about the conflict between China and Japan regarding the Ryukyu Islands. Grant agreed to mediate the Ryukyu conflict between China and Japan in Japan. In June, he arrived in Nagasaki, Japan, via the steamer Richmond. He visited and planted banyan trees in a park, he was invited to plant banyan trees in a park to honor his visit. Grant loved Japan. He enjoyed the beauty and green hills. The people were kind and clean. He visited the emperor at the Summer Palace. He was successful in the negotiations regarding the Ryukyu Islands. During this time, he was asked about the Civil War, and Grant showed his respect for George McClellan, one of the generals that was severely criticized then and ever since. And Grant said that critics did not understand the vast and cruel responsibility, that the Civil War was new to all, and McClellan's failure were based on the fact that the conditions of success were so trying. So he was sympathetic to George McClellan and his problems as general. On September 3rd, they departed Japan on the ship City of Tokyo, bound for San Francisco. Coming home, Grant became a good speaker and diplomat during his trip. He still had no home. He was reading Victor Hugo's Les Miserables voraciously. Grant hated Napoleon and Robespierre. On September 20th, he arrived in San Francisco, California, USA. A question was whether Grant still had presidential ambition. There was another presidential election coming up in 1880. During Grant's trip, Americans enjoyed it through the newspapers and followed it avidly. In October, he took a stagecoach and toured the Yosemite Valley, and then he was in Portland, Oregon. He spoke to a veterans group. He paid for the trip from dividends from the Consolidated Virginia Mining Company in Nevada, in which he had stock. Grant and Julia descended into a mine. They took a whistle-stop train on the Great Plains and was surprised by the growth of towns there. His destination was Galena, Illinois, his old home. He visited in Chicago. There was a gigantic parade in his honor, and he met Mark Twain there. Grant spoke in Chicago. To Civil War veterans, the men sang "Marching Through Georgia." At a get-together, Mark Twain gave a speech and said that Grant's greatest goal as an infant was getting his big toe in his mouth, and as a man he succeeded. Grant laughed hard for 15 minutes at that joke. The trip continued to Louisville, Kentucky, Xenia, Ohio. He met the Civil War soldiers' orphans, including Ed and Frank Zook. Frank Zook, my great-great-grandfather. In Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, there was a parade of 350,000 people for him. On Christmas Eve, he was in New Jersey with his mother and sister and his wife and children. In 1880, the Democrats and ex-Confederates recaptured total control of every state in the South. They were resisting Northern capital. There was economic stagnation in the South. There was labor unrest and railroad strikes in the United States. Grant was interested in a third term. His final days of 1879 were spent at a friend's home in Washington, D.C. In December, he visited Columbia, South Carolina, where he addressed a black militia in Beaufort. Grant believed he could win the states in the South if he was a nominee for president. He also visited St. Augustine, Florida. He supported the temperance movement. Grant said that alcoholism was a major cause of poverty and crime. During the winter, he went to Cuba and Mexico. In Havana, Cuba, he visited the governor's palace. February 18, 1880, he was in Veracruz, Mexico. Grant loved Mexico, the scenery, climate, and people. February 23rd in Mexico City, he met President Porfirio Diaz. He relived the battles of Churubusco and Molina del Rey going back to 1847. March of 1880, he was in Texas. Grant had the appearance of a candidate with giving 4 to 5 speeches a day in the presidential election year. In the South, Grant visited black schools and churches. He spoke at a black church in New Orleans, Louisiana. He visited Vicksburg, Mississippi, 17 years after he bombarded and starved that city. He also visited Cairo, Illinois, where he spent time during the Civil War. Grant met former Confederate officers who expressed satisfaction with the war's outcome. Grant did have some popularity in the South, respect for the noble opponent from the Civil War. Grant did declare his wish to receive the Republican nomination for president. The Republican National Convention in 1880 was in Chicago. Grant's brother Orville came there, and he was drunk. He was a drunk, dirty, shabby vagrant. He had crazy money-making schemes, so he wasn't doing well. He died in 1881 at age 46, and Grant did not attend the funeral. On June 2nd, the Chicago Republican Convention started, and Grant was confident he would get the nomination. In one of his speeches, Grant asked if Republicans in the South, black and white, would be able to vote without being burned out of their homes, threatened, and intimidated. Roscoe Conkling was Grant's manager at the convention. Conkling nominated Grant. Conkling said, quote, "When asked what state he hails from, our sole reply shall be, he comes from Appomattox and its famous apple tree." Conkling mocked Grant's opponents. The response at the convention was derisive shouts. Conkling sucked on a lemon until the uproar subsided. Conkling said, quote, "The shafts and the arrows have all been aimed at him, and they lie broken and harmless at his feet." At that 1880 Republican convention, again, Roscoe Conkling supported Grant. Conkling said, quote, "The election before us is the Austerlitz of American politics. It will decide for many years whether the country shall be Republican or Cossack." The Republican convention, there were 379 votes needed to win to become nominee for president. On the first ballot, Grant had 304 votes, so he was 75 votes short. James Blaine had 284. On the 36th ballot, James Garfield won the nomination with 399 votes, Grant 306. And Grant was okay with losing not getting the nomination. He escaped 4 more years of hard work and abuse as president. Chester A. Arthur was the vice presidential nominee. The Democratic convention was in Cincinnati, Ohio in June, and Winfield Scott Hancock was nominated for president. After the convention, Grant continued his nomadic life. He returned to the Rocky Mountains and visited Jesse, who had become rich from his mining ventures in Arizona and New Mexico. Grant was happy to visit Colorado, which had become a new state. If he didn't have more income, he'd have to live in Galena, Illinois, or on a farm. He needed money to live in a city, and that's where he wanted to live. Grant campaigned for James Garfield. On September 28th, he gave a speech in Warren, Ohio, and Grant stayed at James Garfield's home in Mentor, Ohio, in the Cleveland area. On October 16th, Mark Twain joined Grant's train trip from Boston to Hartford, Connecticut. Grant visited New York City. He also visited the New York Stock Exchange. There was frenzied trading, and Grant thought they were fighting. Grant said, quote, "I am pleased to see you all and wish both bulls and bears success, and that you will all come out without a scratch." Grant was in New York City the night before the election with Chester A. Arthur. There was a nocturnal parade from midnight till 4 in the morning. In the election, James Garfield won, and Grant's campaigning helped. On July 2nd, 1881, Garfield was shot in Washington, D.C. by Charles Guiteau. Grant was among the first to express his sorrow to Lucretia, Garfield's wife. And Garfield died September 19th, and then Chester A. Arthur became the next president. Ulysses S. Grant was sad about the death of James Garfield. In 1880, African Americans, there were 400,000 who voted for Grant in 1868. However, only 170,000 voted in 1880. Blacks in the South were losing the right to vote. So Grant eventually settled in New York City, and that became his home. Authors William Dean Howells and Mark Twain visited him at his home in New York City. Grant served a lunch of baked beans and coffee, and Howells said that it was like sitting down to baked beans and coffee with Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, or some other great Plutarchian captain. In 1882, President Chester A. Arthur honored Grant with a dinner in the White House in March. Arthur named Grant to negotiate a commercial treaty with Mexico. Grant was interested in living in New York City. He continued to worry about money. His Wall Street friends gave him $250,000. Grant wanted to develop a railroad in Mexico. In March of 1881, Grant traveled to Mexico, and Grant was named president of a railroad company. In April, he spoke in Mexico City. That summer, he spent in Long Branch, New Jersey. Grant received a gift of $100,000 for a New York City home. Grant bought a 4-story brownstone at 3 East 66th Street near Fifth Avenue with a view of Central Park. September 29th, he moved in with his son Fred, Fred's wife Ida, and their 2 children. There was an old brass bell, a wooden sword rack, a black lacquer box. These were some of his keepsakes. Grant accepted money in compensation for his national service. Fred was president of the Texas Railroad. His son, Buck, was also successful at Harvard and became U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. Buck was involved in mining ventures, and he handled Grant's investments. His partner was James D. Fish and Ferdinand Ward. Ward was a bad guy, a confidence man. Grant and Ward became the company, and they attracted investors. High profits were made, however, it was a pyramid scheme. Union veterans invested who trusted Grant. They didn't know it was a Ponzi scheme. The new investor money was used to pay old ones. Grant believed that Ward would make them all rich. May 11th, 1888, Grant's mother, Hannah, died. June 28th, 1882, Grant was on a commuter train, express train, at 8:15 in the morning from Long Branch, New Jersey to Jersey City, New Jersey. The passengers included bankers, brokers, and merchants. It was traveling 40 miles an hour and derailed. Several cars went into a creek. The water rushed in. 3 drowned. Grant cut his leg. Had a cut leg. He climbed out of a window. Lost his hat, but his cigar was between his teeth. Grant had a servant named Terrell Harrison who was black, African American. His son Robert was a Harvard student. Grant recommended him for a summer job at the Boston Custom House. Robert Harrison later became the first African American judge in Washington, D.C. On August 30th, Grant took a trip west. He celebrated the completion of the Northern Pacific Railroad. Grant hammered in the Golden Spike. This was in Bismarck in the Dakota Territory. On Christmas Eve, 1883, they were living in their Manhattan townhouse. He was coming home. He fell on the icy pavement and tore his thigh muscle and broke his hip. He was in severe pain and he was bedridden on crutches to get around. He also had pleurisy and rheumatism. He was growing old in pain and sorrow. March of 1884, he took a trip to Old Point, Comfort, Virginia. Grant was a symbol between North and South reconciliation. He met with a delegation of black soldiers. He was in physical pain. However, he was not worrying about money. However, on May 4th, 1884, Ferdinand Ward visited Grant. It was expressed that he was in financial trouble. He needed money. Grant visited his friend William H. Vanderbilt and asked for $150,000, and Vanderbilt agreed to the loan. However, it didn't help. On May 6th, the Marine National Bank closed. Ferdinand Ward, the young Napoleon of finance, a financial wizard who was Grant's partner, and temporarily helped Grant become a millionaire, but it was based on fraud. The money was gone. Grant became poor. He needed to cast off his stigma of failure and reclaim his success. Summer of 1884, he had a sore throat. He'd been smoking 20 cigars a day, and he had developed throat cancer. He was terrified that he would die and leave Julia destitute, so he agreed to write his memoirs. May 6th is when the financial ruin came. He had $1 million that was lost. Grant had no money. The investors in the company, Ward and Grant, lost $16 million. Grant was defeated. He owed William Vanderbilt $140,000. He gave Vanderbilt the title to his East 66th Street house and his St. Louis property. Grant couldn't pay for the household help. He was abandoned by his rich friends. His Mexican friend Matias Romero loaned him $1,000. A veteran, Charles Wood, loaned him $1,500, quote, for services ending about April 1865. Grant's son, Buck, lost $1.7 million. Grant was humiliated. There was enormous public sympathy for Grant. Ferdinand Ward was arrested on May 21st. Grant spent the summer of 1884 in Long Branch, New Jersey. The household staff was dismissed. There was no money. Julia had to cook. The Century magazine editor visited. He offered to pay Grant $2,000 for his stories about Shiloh, Vicksburg, the Wilderness, and Chattanooga, battles in the Civil War. The Century editors wanted Grant to write his memoirs. Grant had lost all his money. His biographer H.W. Brands wrote, quote, in his desolation in the 1850s, Ulysses S. Grant had lamented that poverty stared him in the face. He felt its icy gaze again. So Grant started writing, and words poured from him. He had pent-up feeling he could express. There was a tumor in his neck the size of a baseball, which he covered with a shawl. He was in constant pain except when sleeping. However, he remained very stoic. Grant had repeatedly bounced back from adversity. Walt Whitman said that the greatest Americans were George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Ulysses S. Grant. In October of 1884, Grant returned to New York City. He went to the doctor regarding the swollen area in the back of his tongue, which was cancerous. He was given cocaine to relieve the pain. Grant was in severe pain. He took a horse-drawn streetcar to see the doctor. He couldn't afford a private cab. He finally bought a carriage. He had cancer of the throat and tongue. The prognosis was death in less than a year. Grant lost his craving for tobacco. His last cigar was on November 20th. Julia believed that smoking was healthy. She did not understand that cigars had killed Ulysses S. Grant. Grant had been in the habit of smoking 25 cigars a day for many years. In November of 1884, Grant quit smoking cigars and said to his friends, quote, "Gentlemen, this is the last cigar I shall ever smoke. The doctors tell me that I will never live to finish the work on which my whole energy is centered these days, if I do not cease indulging in these fragrant weeds. It is hard to give up an old and cherished friend that has been my comforter and solace through many weary nights and days, but my unfinished work must be completed for the sake of those that are near and dear to me." This was at Walnut Grove Farm in Goshen, New York. Adam Badeau, his personal secretary, said this about Christmas 1884 with Grant and was with his grandchildren, quote, "I shall never forget the frolic with the little ones on Christmas Day. They all came to dinner, and the two youngest sat on each side of him. He was comparatively free from pain. The children monopolized the conversation, and when their mammas endeavored to check them, the general interposed and declared that this was their day. So they prattled across their grandpa and made preposterous attempts at jokes, and no one laughed more heartily than the great warrior, their progenitor. It was a delicious morsel of sweet in the midst of much bitter care, a gleam of satisfaction in the gloom of that sad winter, with its fears and uncertainties and sorrows." 1884 was an election year. Grant supported the Republican James Blaine. However, the Democrat Grover Cleveland won. The national consensus was that Reconstruction had been a failure. Grant worried that if he died, that Julia would be destitute. So he was writing his memoirs to produce income. The Century editors he was working with. Fred helped. Adam Badeau also helped. Grant gave up his pew at the Madison Avenue Church because he couldn't pay the rent. In November of 1884, Grant was in constant pain. He couldn't eat solid food or he drank milk. It was painful to eat and drink. When Grant laid down, he had a sense he was strangling. He slept in a chair. He had insomnia and apathy. However, he overcame that, returned working. He wrote for 4 or 5 hours a day. Century editors had offered Grant a 10% royalty. Mark Twain got interested. Twain visited Grant, and Twain thought that the Century deal was unfair. He proposed a 20% royalty or 70% profits. He offered Grant a check for $50,000. Grant did make a deal with Mark Twain, and he agreed to 70% of the profits with Mark Twain. Another visitor was Lew Wallace, who was with Grant at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in Shiloh. In 1880, Lew Wallace became famous by publishing the historical novel Ben-Hur. Another visitor for Grant was William Tecumseh Sherman around Christmas of 1884. Grant's granddaughter Julia said, quote, "Seeing grandmama's worry over my grandfather's silence, which she attributed to pain, I remember one day when her husband, having left the room, she mentioned this. General Sherman, walking up and down, said to her, 'But the general was always silent, Mr. Grant. Even at the worst of strain, I used to go see him at his headquarters, and he would sit perfectly still like he did here today. I just walked up and down and swore then. And I'm sure it did your husband lots of good, ma'am, and relieved his mind to have me do it for him.' Grandmama laughed and was consoled." P.T. Barnum, the famous entertainer, wrote a letter to Grant. He offered him $100,000 to exhibit Grant's swords, medals, and gifts from foreign heads of state. And Barnum visited, but Grant declined his offer. Grant received a letter from Confederate Brigadier General Raleigh E. Colston that said, quote, "Those whom he, Grant, treated generously in the day of their sorrow at Pomatock's courthouse, remember him gratefully in his hour of tribulation." So Ulysses S. Grant was facing these twin severe challenges: financial distress and very poor health. In January of 1885, doctors removed all of Grant's rotted teeth to alleviate his throat pain. Grant wanted to travel to Hot Springs, Arkansas, but he was too weak. In January of 1885, Julia could not accept that Grant's death was approaching and said, quote, "I could not believe that God would take this great, wise, good man from us to whom he was so necessary and beloved." Mark Twain gave a leather-bound edition of Huckleberry Finn inscribed to Fred's daughter, Julia. Grant's deal with Twain, involving his memoirs, became a 2-volume box set. Civil War veterans went door to door selling subscriptions. February of 1885, Grant wrote, quote, "We have all been as happy as could be expected, considering our great losses and my personal suffering. Philosophers profess to believe that what is for the best. I hope that it may be so with our family." This was a letter to his friend, George Childs. Well, that concludes today's presentation. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. God bless you. Take care, and I'll see you next time.